At 7:47 in the evening, 27 chairs sat empty in the grand ballroom of the Bellevue Hotel in Philadelphia. The crystal chandeliers still blazed overhead, throwing gold light across a 5-tier cake, whiskey and dark chocolate standing alone at the center of the room like a monument to something that had never happened. Wesley Hamilton sat in his black wheelchair in the middle of the floor, his hands still on his lap, his legs unmoving beneath him. He had turned 34 years old 12 minutes ago, and not one guest had arrived. He was not shouting. He was not breaking glasses or overturning chairs the way men in his position were expected to when they were disrespected. He simply tilted his head, studied the cake as if it were a stranger's face, and said one quiet word to the man behind him. "Stop the music." The jazz trio in the corner went silent mid-phrase. The only sound left in the enormous room was the tick of a wall clock, counting seconds that no one else seemed to care about. Thomas Kelly stood just behind his chair, his voice smooth as he read off another string of excuses. Senator Doyle's flight was delayed. The Marchetti family had a sudden emergency. Underboss Reyes sent his deepest regrets. Thomas delivered each name gently, almost tenderly, as if sympathy could soften the truth that was already sitting in the room like a fourth presence nobody wanted to acknowledge. Rachel Adams stood a few feet away, scrolling through her phone, murmuring that 3 more cancellation texts had just come in. She didn't look up when she said it. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room already understood what an empty ballroom meant for a man like Wesley Hamilton. 2 years ago, he had commanded a room simply by entering it. 2 years ago, one phone call from him could fill this same ballroom with senators, judges, and men who ran half the ports on the eastern seaboard. But 2 years ago, he could also still walk. Now his legs sat still beneath a $2,000 suit, paralyzed since the night a bullet found his spine outside Independence Hall, the same night his driver had died in the front seat, taking the second shot meant for him. He remembered that night with a clarity he wished he didn't have. The smell of gunpowder and wet asphalt, the driver's hand still gripping the wheel after his heart had already stopped. The sirens arriving 4 minutes too late to matter. Thomas glanced at his watch for the 4th time in 5 minutes. A small tell he probably didn't know he was making. Rachel typed something under the table instead of answering the caterer's question about whether to start clearing the plates. Wesley noticed both of these things. He noticed everything. It was perhaps the only part of him the shooting hadn't taken. He looked at the cake once more, then asked a question that made the entire room go still. "Do you think they'd have come if I could still walk?" Thomas forced a laugh, the kind men use when they're buying themselves a second to think. "Boss, you're overthinking this." Wesley didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence that followed said more than any accusation could have. That was when the tall wooden double doors at the far end of the ballroom creaked open. Audrey Foster stood in the doorway, holding a tray of damp hand towels, her cheeks flushed from running up 3 flights of stairs from the laundry room. Her pale gray uniform clung slightly to her shoulders, damp with the effort of getting somewhere on time for once in her life. She hadn't expected anyone to be looking at the door. She hadn't expected anyone to be looking at her at all. But Wesley Hamilton was looking. His pale blue eyes, the color of steel left out in winter, found her from across the empty ballroom, and for a reason she couldn't name, she felt the air in the room change. In the shadowed corner of the hallway, just outside, an old man in a worn black leather jacket did not look toward the door. Peter Wood's eyes were fixed instead on the thin silver bracelet circling the young woman's wrist. His lips moved almost silently into the radio clipped to his collar. "She's wearing it," he whispered. "Start the 3-day count." No one else heard him. no one else was meant to. Audrey took a step forward into the ballroom, unaware that a promise 19 years in the making had just been set into motion by nothing more than her own 2 feet crossing a threshold she had never meant to cross. She had wandered without any invitation at all into the private world of a mafia boss. She had been told to bring towels to the service entrance. She had taken a wrong turn near the kitchen elevator, and now she was standing in the middle of the most powerful and most humiliated man in Philadelphia, holding a tray no one had asked her to bring here. She should have turned around. Every instinct told her to apologize and disappear back through the doors the way she had come. Instead, she found she could not move. His eyes held her the way gravity holds a falling object, not by force, but by a law neither of them had written. Somewhere behind her, the old bodyguard kept his eyes on her wrist and whispered one more thing into his radio so quiet, even the walls barely caught it. She doesn't know yet what she's carrying. 3 days, and then we tell her everything. The chandeliers burned on above 27 empty chairs. The cake stood untouched. And in the doorway of a ballroom built for celebration, a shy maid who had wandered in by mistake became, without knowing it, the only reason this night would ever be remembered. Somewhere in that room, a birthday that was supposed to end in humiliation had just quietly begun to turn into something else entirely. Audrey had barely stepped back into the hallway when 3 women in expensive evening gowns blocked her path. They were the wives of underbosses who had canceled that very evening women who had chosen silk and diamonds over showing up for a man they now considered a liability. One of them looked Audrey up and down, slowly, her mouth curling before she spoke loud enough that 3 passing hotel staff turned their heads. "Look at her hurrying around in that little uniform," the woman said, letting her eyes linger with open contempt. "I suppose the hotel hires whoever's cheapest to carry towels these days. Move along, dear, before you trip over your own feet and ruin the carpet for the rest of us." Audrey didn't answer. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, her knuckles white around the edge of the tray, and lowered her eyes the way she had learned to do since she was young enough to know that some battles weren't worth fighting in front of an audience that had already decided to laugh. She began to step around them. That was when her fingers, out of old habit, brushed against the thin silver bracelet on her left wrist. The one thing of her father's she had never taken off since the day he'd left their apartment when she was 12 years old. The hallway light caught the inside of the band at just the right angle, and for the first time in her life, she noticed there was something engraved there. Tiny letters, nearly worn smooth. Blood of the driver. She had no time to make sense of it before a firm, careful hand caught her wrist and pulled her gently into the shadow of a side alcove. Peter Wood's voice was low, almost gravelly with age. "Give this to him," he said, pressing a worn envelope into her hand. "He owes your father his life. Has for a long time." Inside was a check, yellowed with age, folded around a handwritten note in ink, faded by years she couldn't remember living through. Audrey walked into the ballroom before she'd fully decided to. Wesley's eyes tracked her across the marble floor, lingering for one unmistakable second before returning respectfully to her face. Thomas stepped forward, his tone dismissive. "Boss, don't waste your evening on some maid. All they know how to do is mop floors and beg for tips." Audrey did not lower her head this time. She looked directly into Wesley's pale blue eyes and spoke with a steadiness that surprised even her. "I'm not begging for anything." Wesley raised a single finger. The room went silent instantly, as if the gesture itself carried weight. She set the envelope on the table beside the untouched cake. A second, thinner slip of paper slid out as the envelope settled. Her father's handwriting, hurried and urgent, clearly written in fear of running out of time. "If my daughter ever finds her way to you, give her the key to Vault 7. Only her blood can open it." Wesley read the words twice. Something behind his eyes went dark and still like a lake freezing over in a single breath. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something colder than anything Thomas or Rachel had heard from him in months. "You're staying." The image of a maid publicly humiliated in a hallway, only to be the one person in the entire building brave enough to look a mafia boss in the eye and refuse to beg, was the kind of contrast that made an audience's chest tighten with quiet fury and quiet pride at once. But one question hung over the room, louder than any of it. If only her blood could open whatever was hidden behind Vault 7, what exactly had her father left behind? And why did the mention of it change everything in Wesley Hamilton's face? Wesley just chose a maid who insulted no one over the underboss's wives who humiliated her in the hallway. If you were sitting at that table, whose side would you have been on before you knew anything about the envelope, the powerful women who mocked her, or the boss who silenced the room for her? Say envelope or underbosses in the comments. No fence-sitting. Audrey reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out a small flash drive, along with an old, scratched tablet she had carried with her for longer than she could explain. Her hands trembled slightly as she connected it to the ballroom's projection system. The massive screen at the front of the room flickered to life. One by one, ordinary faces appeared. A retired driver, a car wash attendant, an elderly flower vendor from Old City, each of them speaking briefly, almost shyly, about quiet acts of kindness Wesley Hamilton had done over the years, without ever asking for recognition. Audrey stood beside the screen, unsure why she had even brought this tonight, only that some part of her had wanted him to know he wasn't as forgotten as the empty chairs made him feel. Then, midway through the footage, a hidden file triggered automatically, one she hadn't put there, one she didn't understand. Peter Wood stepped out from the shadows near the back wall, a pistol steady in his weathered hand, its barrel aimed at Thomas Kelly. "Boss," Peter said evenly, "he wired $12 million to a Cayman account last week. It's all on that drive. I've been building this file for months. I just needed the right night to use it." Thomas struggled against the grip restraining him, but managed to twist his head toward Audrey, his voice sharp with contempt even as his composure cracked. "You think a maid saved the boss? You're nothing but the scraps your father left behind." Audrey didn't step back. She took one deliberate step toward him instead, her voice calm in a way that felt far more dangerous than shouting ever could. "My father died in his place. I'm not anyone's leftover." A second encrypted window opened on the screen without warning. A long string of numbers appeared, matching impossibly the engraving hidden inside Audrey's bracelet. Peter's voice dropped low as he spoke only to Wesley. "Only the driver's blood opens Vault 7, boss. She's the last piece of a promise your family made a long time ago." Wesley rolled his chair forward and for the first time reached out and rested his hand over hers on the table. His voice came out hoarse. "No one touches her again." Then, as if the night hadn't already delivered enough, Rachel Adams was marched past the group, her phone slipping from her grip and landing screen up on the marble floor. It stayed lit. A string of messages from 2 years earlier glowed on the display. Her own words sent the night of the shooting, giving Hamilton's location to the man who pulled the trigger. The room seemed to hold its breath collectively. 2 betrayals, one hidden inside a bracelet, one hidden inside a phone, had surfaced within the same suffocating minute, and no one in the ballroom could look away. Wesley's jaw tightened as he stared at the glowing screen on the floor. 2 years of quiet trust unraveling in real time in front of the very people who had built their loyalty around him. Wesley's stillness in this moment isn't calm. It's control, doing the only job it has left. What he actually wants isn't revenge on Rachel. It's certainty, the thing his body took from him the night he lost the use of his legs. For 2 years, he has run his organization by trusting no signal but his own instincts, and Rachel's betrayal proves those instincts failed him once already. The conflict eating at him right now is simple and brutal. If he couldn't see this coming, what else has he missed? And can he actually let himself lean on Audrey's discovery instead of only his own judgment?
"How long," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "has this been sitting inside my own house?"
Peter's grip on Thomas didn't loosen. "Longer than any of us wanted to know, boss."
Audrey stood frozen beside the table, the flash drive still glowing faintly where it connected to the machine. The weight of what she had just triggered settling over her shoulders like something physical. She hadn't understood when Peter handed her that envelope in the hallway that she was carrying the end of 2 men's careful, patient lies. Wesley studied her face for a long moment, not with suspicion, with something closer to recognition, as though he were finally seeing the shape of a debt he had carried for 2 years without knowing whose name belonged on it.
"Your father worked for my family," he said slowly, "since before I could drive a car myself." Audrey's throat tightened. "He left us when I was 12. My mother said he walked out. She never once said he died. She let me believe he simply didn't want us anymore."
"He didn't leave because he stopped wanting you," Wesley said. "He left because the work he did for this family put a target on anyone he loved. He thought distance was the only kindness he had left to give you. He watched you from a distance for years, Audrey. And 2 years ago, he put his body between me and a second bullet that would have taken my head instead of my spine." The room was utterly silent, except for the low hum of the projector still running old footage of strangers describing kindnesses no one had asked them to describe. Audrey felt something crack open in her chest. Not grief exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a truth so large she didn't have anywhere to put it. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had spent 13 years disappearing on purpose to keep her safe. And the last 2 of those years he had spent protecting a stranger who was about to become the center of her entire life. If a man who had betrayed the organization for 2 years had been standing quietly in plain sight the whole time, waiting, how many more were still seated comfortably around this mafia boss, watching him grow weaker, waiting for the moment he could no longer protect himself at all. And somewhere beneath the hotel, locked behind a vault that only her blood could open, something her father had guarded with his life was still waiting to be found. The ballroom remained so quiet that Audrey could hear her own breathing. Wesley turned his chair to face her directly, his pale eyes never leaving hers. He spoke clearly, loud enough for every remaining staff member in the room to hear. "Your father died protecting me. I owe you the rest of my life for that." Audrey took half a step back, unsteadied by the weight of the words. He didn't let her retreat further. The wheelchair rolled forward, closing the distance again. He took her hand gently, drew it down to meet his eyes, and pressed his lips to the back of it. An old, formal gesture from another era of his world, one that carried an unmistakable meaning of protection, not romance for its own sake. In the world of a mafia boss, a gesture like that was never simple, and everyone in the room understood exactly what it meant. His voice carried across the room. "As of tonight, you are no longer staff here. You'll stay in this house under my protection for as long as you need." It wasn't a request, and everyone in the room understood that. The staff and the few loyal faces left in the ballroom witnessed it in silence. Then, quietly enough that only she could hear, he leaned closer, his breath stirring the loose strands of hair near her temple. "I'm not doing this only because I owe your father. I'm doing it because I've spent 2 years wondering who was left to finish what he started, and it was you the whole time." Rachel Adams, still being escorted out under guard, managed one last remark over her shoulder. "Enjoying playing the hero's new favorite, are you?"
Men like him are grateful right up until they're not. Audrey didn't even glance at her. She kept her eyes on Wesley and spoke loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "Say what you want. I'm not going anywhere." As Rachel was pushed further out, the large screen behind them flickered back to life without warning. The full chain of messages between Rachel and Thomas lit up across the wall. 2 years of quiet treachery, the Cayman transfer, the coordinates sent the night of the shooting, all displayed in cold, undeniable text. Whatever standing the two of them had once held inside the organization collapsed in that single, silent moment. The image of a paralyzed boss pressing his lips to a maid's hand in front of the room, declaring her protected in the same breath that a screen behind them exposed years of betrayal, was the kind of moment that left no one in that ballroom breathing normally. Later, once the last of the guards had cleared the room and the staff had begun quietly wheeling away trays of untouched food, Wesley asked her to sit near him at the edge of the ballroom, away from the wreckage of the night.
"You should know something else," he said. "Your father wasn't just a driver to me. He was the only person outside my own blood who ever had access to something my family has protected for 19 years.
"What is it?" Audrey asked.
"I don't fully know," he admitted, and for a man who seemed to command every detail of every room he entered, the honesty of that answer startled her. "He built the lock himself long before I was old enough to understand what it meant. He only ever told me who could open it if he wasn't around to do it himself."
Audrey looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, the one she had worn every day since she was 12, without ever asking her mother why her father had left it behind. "He gave this to me the week before he disappeared. My mother told me it was cheap costume jewelry. She told me not to lose it and never explained why." "It's not cheap," Wesley said quietly. "Right now, it might be the only thing in the world that matters more to me than staying alive."
What Wesley wants underneath the debt and the ceremony is simpler and more frightening than loyalty. He wants to stop being alone inside his own body. For 2 years, he has let people manage him instead of know him, treating his paralysis as a weakness to hide rather than a truth to share. His real conflict tonight isn't whether Audrey is safe. It's whether he can let one person see him as unguarded as he actually is, without immediately trying to control what that costs him. That's why the confession comes out low and almost accidental. It's the first honest thing he's said out loud since the shooting. Outside the tall windows of the ballroom, the lights of Philadelphia stretched into the dark, indifferent to everything that had just unfolded inside. Somewhere out there, more people who had once smiled at Wesley Hamilton's dinner table were likely still waiting, still calculating how much longer a paralyzed man could hold on to power that used to come as easily as breathing. Audrey didn't know yet how deep that betrayal ran, or how many more faces in his organization were quietly hoping for his downfall. But sitting there, in the wreckage of a birthday no one had wanted to attend, she understood that she had already become something she never intended to be. What kind of promise could make a man like Wesley Hamilton admit that a stranger's survival mattered to him more than his own? And was he even fully aware yet of how true those words might turn out to be? 3 days passed. One by one, the disloyal names inside Wesley Hamilton's organization were quietly stripped of everything they had: their titles, their territories, their protection. No headlines followed. No one asked questions out loud. In Wesley's world, that kind of silence was its own sentence. Wesley called Audrey into his top-floor office overlooking the Delaware River. The late afternoon light spilled through the tall windows, casting long, gold shadows across the hardwood floor. He set a single unused invitation card on the desk between them and slid it toward the trash without ceremony.
They didn't deserve to sit at the same table as you, he said. None of them did. Then he opened a drawer and drew out a faded photograph. In it stood a man Audrey slowly recognized as a younger version of her father, standing beside a boy no older than 15. A boy, Audrey realized with a chill crawling up her spine, was Wesley himself.
"Your father pulled me out of the river the winter I turned 15, Wesley said. A rival family had put me there to send my father a message. Your father wasn't even supposed to be on that dock that night. He jumped in anyway." On the back of the photograph, in hurried black ink, someone had written a promise meant for another lifetime. "If I die, find my daughter. She'll be able to open what I've hidden." 4 years after that river, Wesley continued, my father signed an agreement with yours, written in your father's own blood, the way things were done back then. It was the only way your father would accept anything in return for what he'd done. He didn't want money. He wanted a guarantee, one that would outlive both of them. Audrey's hands shook slightly as she held the photograph.
"You knew my father when you were a child."
"He was the only man in this organization who ever treated me like a person instead of an heir to be managed," Wesley said. He looked at her directly, then his voice quieter than she had heard it all week. "I've been looking for you since the night he died, protecting me. 2 years, Audrey. I searched every record the city had. Foster placements, school transfers, 3 different last names. You moved so often it was almost impossible to find you." "So the birthday," Audrey said, slowly piecing it together even as her voice trembled. "The empty chairs, that wasn't just bad luck." "No," Wesley admitted. "I let this year's guest list thin itself out on purpose. I told Thomas not to push too hard on the reminders. I needed the ballroom quiet enough and empty enough that if you ever wandered in, you'd actually be seen instead of lost in a crowd of people who never mattered to me anyway." Audrey stood very still, her fingers tightening around the edge of the photograph. For the first time since she had stumbled into that ballroom holding a tray of damp towels, she understood that she had never truly been an outsider, stumbling into someone else's story. She had been the missing piece of it the entire time. Wesley reached into his desk drawer one final time and produced a brass room key, sliding it across the desk toward her. "The room next to mine. Not a request, just the truth of where you're safest." That night, once the house had gone quiet and the last of the staff had retired for the evening, Peter Wood knocked softly on Audrey's door. When she opened it, he pressed a cold iron key into her palm, his voice barely above a whisper. "Vault 7 is beneath the wine cellar," he said. "Only your blood opens it. He's never gone down there alone in all the years I've worked for him." "Why not?" Audrey asked. Peter's weathered face softened with something close to sorrow. "Because your father made him promise something the day the ink dried on that contract, and Wesley spent 19 years too afraid to find out exactly what it costs him." "What's down there?" Audrey asked. "I don't know," Peter admitted. "Nobody but your father ever knew. He built that vault with his own hands and told no one what was inside, only who could open it and why it would matter more than any of us understood at the time." Long after Peter had gone, Audrey sat by the window of her new room, turning the iron key over in her fingers, watching the lights of the city flicker along the river. Somewhere beneath the very floor she was about to sleep, above a promise older than her own memories, was waiting for her. One her own father had trusted no one else to carry. She thought of the women in the hallway who had sneered at her uniform, of Thomas's contempt, of Rachel's betrayal glowing on a cracked phone screen. None of it mattered anymore, not really. What mattered now was the question that kept circling back through her mind as she finally closed her eyes. What could possibly be locked inside Vault 7? Something so significant that even a man as unshaken as this Mafia boss
was still too afraid to open it alone.
1 year later, the same ballroom on the top floor of the Bellevue Hotel glowed with warm light once again. The same 5-tier cake stood at the center of the room, whiskey and dark chocolate, exactly as it had the year before. But this time, 27 chairs were filled with familiar, loyal faces.
Audrey sat beside Wesley's wheelchair, dressed in a long black gown that suited her fully, her hair loose over her shoulders. There was no gray uniform left in her closet anymore. No tray of towels waiting to be delivered to someone who wouldn't remember her name. Wesley took the microphone, his voice low but carrying easily across the crowded room.
Last year, no one came. This year, I only ever needed one person to make it feel full.
He turned to Audrey, took her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it once more, this time in front of the entire organization gathered to witness it. From today on, whoever disrespects her, disrespects me. That's the only rule that's ever mattered in this house. Before anyone could begin the familiar chorus of a birthday song, Wesley raised a hand toward Peter Wood. 2 men carried in a worn, heavy iron safe and set it down in the center of the ballroom floor. The room fell into absolute silence. Wesley looked at Audrey and said quietly, "It's time. Open it." She pressed her fingertip against the biometric lock, letting a single drop of blood fall against the sensor. The vault clicked open in the stillness, and every guest in the room seemed to lean forward at once. Inside was no money, no weapons, no gold, only a single aged contract, its ink written in her father's own blood 19 years earlier. The same year of the photograph, the same year he pulled a drowning 15-year-old boy out of the Delaware River and asked for nothing but a promise in return. The words beneath the ballroom lights read clearly for anyone close enough to see. Whoever carried her father's bloodline would hold the only second vote with the power to veto any decision the head of the Hamilton family made. Without that vote, the entire authority of the Hamilton name would be permanently void. Wesley looked at her in front of hundreds of watching eyes, his voice hoarse with an honesty he had clearly never allowed himself in public before. "I didn't just need you to survive, Audrey. I needed you so I could still be allowed to sit in this chair at all. Without you, everything I built here is just an empty room." The room fell into a silence so complete that the ticking of the wall clock could be heard again, just as it had been the night this all began. Audrey finally understood, standing there, that she had never truly been the one who needed protecting. She had been the one thing standing between this entire world and its collapse the whole time, and her father had known it 19 years before she was even born into the promise. Wesley pressed his lips to the back of her hand one final time, slower now, as if sealing something rather than simply repeating it. She didn't pull away. Her cheeks flushed, but something in her eyes had changed completely. There was no trace left of the timid maid who had once lowered her head in a hallway and let cruel words pass over her like weather. She thought of her father, whose face she barely remembered from before he disappeared, who had spent 13 years watching her from a distance to keep her safe, and 2 more years dying to keep someone else's promise alive. She thought of every person who had once looked at her and decided she was worth nothing more than a passing insult. And she thought of how far one silver bracelet had carried her, from a damp laundry room 3 floors below a birthday no one attended, to a ballroom full of people who now understood exactly who she was, standing beside a Mafia boss who once ruled entirely through fear, and now, for the first time, ruled through something sturdier. Wesley's steel blue eyes held hers the way they had from the very first moment she stepped through those double doors, like she was the one thing in Philadelphia he would give up everything else to protect, and the only reason he still deserved to sit in the chair
that 1 year ago not a single soul had bothered to fill.
This story reminds us that the quiet corners of a life, a spare room, a Tuesday afternoon, a name remembered out loud, often matter more than anything wrapped in gold paper. If you've lost a spouse, or you're sitting in a house that used to be louder than it is now, here's something worth trying this week. Call one person whose kindness you've never properly thanked and tell them exactly what they did and why it stayed with you. Not a card, a phone call, or better, a visit with a cup of coffee in your hand. If you're retired and the days feel like empty chairs where colleagues used to sit, look for the one person nobody else seems to be checking on. A neighbor, the cashier who always remembers your order, the mail carrier who waves every single day. A 5-minute conversation costs you nothing, and it might be the only real conversation someone has all day. Dignity was never about being loud. It's the woman who keeps showing up decently, even when no one's watching. And the man who finally admits out loud that he needs someone. If today feels emptier than you'd like, don't wait for a grand gesture. Fill one chair. Start there. If Audrey's transformation moved you tonight, tell us in the comments which moment hit you hardest, and if you believe quiet kindness like hers still changes lives today, like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength finally being seen.